We've had our Scarlet-W for about a year now, and we've used it in pretty much every production scenario you can imagine. Live events, highly produced pieces, running gun, you name it. There's some pros, there's some cons. Let's talk about those here on Real Talk. At PEG, we have a number of different cameras, everything from GoPros all the way up to our top-of-the-line camera, which would be our RED Scarlet-W. Like we were saying before, we have had our RED for about a year now, which means we have seen the ups and the downs. We each took a little bit of time and picked our top 2 pros and our top 2 cons, and well, let's go over them.
Yeah, absolutely. But one thing I want to definitely start off by saying, Jeffrey, is you and I have, we've been in the video production world for quite some time now, but we've definitely had different backgrounds when it comes to the cameras that we've used, and I think the history with our different cameras definitely will impact kind of our pros and cons with this RED Scarlet-W. And I know you, for example, have had a lot of history with the high-end broadcast and ENG style cameras, and I'm a little bit more familiar with like the Black Magic and kind of the indie cameras, DSLRs. But then we also have definitely some crossover with our FS7s and our A7 that we've been filming a lot with. So I think, you know, what we've filmed with that and what we've liked and disliked with those cameras are definitely going to play a part in kind of our pros and cons here today.
Sure. And let's start out with my first pro, which is just sheer image quality. RED's known for their image quality. That's almost a given, but after using it from a year, we can confirm that it definitely lives up to the hype. Whether you're shooting it in 5K, which this camera essentially does 5K at a normal frame rate, 24p typically, and also does high frame rate at 4K, which is about 120 frames per second, which there are certainly other cameras that can do more, but 120 will do pretty much everything you need it to. I can't say we've ever really had a time that we've gotten into an edit and said, oh, I wish it was a little slower. Like, usually that's pretty good. And that's enough to do pretty much everything you need in terms of like standard documentary slow-mo type shots. The image quality on this is great. I wouldn't call it grainless. No camera's really grainless. But definitely after coming from a world of, you know, whether it's Sony FS7s, A7s, those types of cameras, this has definitely got a more reliable profile and is about as grain-free as you can get. If you need to do additional work on it, whether that be doing sharpening, because this camera does not sharpen in camera, you do that in post, which is totally fine and actually gives you more flexibility. Or to pull some grain out, it's got its own grain removal tools. You also can use something like a denoiser if you want something that's a little more aggressive and while it might remove some quality, you know, we'll pull some grain out of it. But, you know, people talk a lot about RED and low light not being very good. Actually, these newer models are pretty good. I don't think it's as good as necessarily an A7, which of course is a camera that people historically have said that's one of the best selling points of the camera is its low light capabilities, but it can definitely hold its own. It's as good or better than an FS7, and it's pretty much on par with other large sensor cameras. 5K is great, of course, in post. This will do 5K. A lot of cameras don't do that even now. That just gives you a little extra bit of cropping power to pull something out of the frame or to get a little tighter if you want for more dramatic moment. Fixed rotation, which happens often, is, you know, hey, I'm a degree off. That's okay, I'll crop in a little bit, rotate. Now it's great looking. So just the sheer image quality alone is definitely lives up to the height of pure image quality being just overall great.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, like you were saying with 5K resolution, which is just an awesome thing just to have, you know, you know, you're not overworking the system by shooting in 5K. It's frankly just this camera's standard. So, you know, the standard request that we still get, you know, 1080 is still the most popular request. We're getting a lot more clients and just a lot more interest in 4K. And it's great to know that we've made an investment in a camera that can easily do 4K and 5K on top of that. So it's just, it makes us feel reassured that we've made a investment in a camera that we're going to have for a while.
It's not a feature you necessarily think you need right when you get it. I mean, like, when we got it, frankly, we kind of thought, oh, well, it's 5K, but I mean, people are just shooting the 4K. Why would you shoot anything other than 4K? One of the quirks about this camera in the first place is that if you're not shooting in 5K, you're not using the whole size of the sensor, so it'll actually crop in. You know, if you think of a full sensor size, it will start to crop in the lower the resolution you go. So if you go down to 4K, it'll get a little tighter. If you go on 1080p, it'll get really tight. So you almost need to shoot to 5K to really get the full, nice, big sensor. But that's what we would do anyway, because once you get used to, you know what, I can say a hair wider because I can always fix this. You just tend to use it. It's just one more tool.
Absolutely. And I think one of the big tools for me, using this camera, doing a lot of edits with it, a lot of shoots with it, this is my first camera that you get the actual RAW files. And that has been a fantastic, fantastic thing. We run around a lot of shoots. I'd love to say that we have the time, to grab a quick white balance, especially if we're moving around a lot, before the shot rolls. But a lot of times we're moving quick, or it's a really complex shot. We might be thinking, more towards, what's about to happen. Are our actors good? Is everything ready? We may forget to white balance. So, with the shooting with RAW, you're able to actually go into the edit and tweak your white balance and your tint. And one of the big features with having it in RAW is you're tweaking it, you're actually setting it. And what the big thing with that is, you're not alterating, you're not taking away green or adding in pink or doing all this actual manipulation that could, cause grain to show up in your clips. You're picking, whatever white balance you want without any damage to the clip.
Everybody color grades a little differently, but I would say the standard approach most people do when they get something like a log image from like a Sony camera that might be shooting to S-Log, they pretty much take that and bring it to a nice neutral grade first, and then a lot of times they go from there and do secondary color correction to, okay, I want it to look a little film mix, and maybe I'll either pull back that primary or I'll shift it a little bit or add a little bit of warmth. Stuff like that. This saves you a lot of time in so much as you don't really have to spend that time that okay, I got my FS7 S-Log footage. I'm going to bring it to a neutral grade. That's going to take a little while in the first place. And then I'm going to edit it from there. You start with a neutral grade here. And what Andrew's saying about white balance is absolutely true. That sounds like a silly thing. People that are used to, for instance, like ENG cameras, they're used to having a single button and they press it and white becomes white. That's how it should work, at least in our opinion. Like for instance, our FS7s, one of the things we notoriously joke about is they don't have a white balance in most modes. There are some modes that have it, but the mode that probably everybody uses the most, Cine EL kind of custom modes, you just pick your preset and then you white balance in post. Now, to Sony, they say, well, that's just a matter of doing a white balance selector. It's that easy. But realistically, it's easier to do it like this. It just is. It's way easier to just go back to having a button you press and then in post it's aligned. Maybe the shot that you're doing doesn't have a thing that has white in the shot, and you're recording on it, you have no reference point, and then you're looking at shots near it and hoping that your white balance didn't change, as you go from location to location. Just trust us. It's way easier to just have a white card, especially for a run and gun type shoot that you pop in front of the camera. White is white. And if I want to edit it in post, I can still do that. I can way more than do that with the RAW panel, but I have a good starting point.
Yeah, and with those RAW files, you have a lot of data that you have access to. And, you can do more to a clip that you would, than you'd be used to with something like just something that was shot directly to ProRes. You can do more to a clip to get the final image that you want, again, with introducing grain or potentially, damaging the clip and not getting you get the look that you want, but now the quality has taken a huge hit. Not a problem with this guy right here.
Another feature that people don't talk a lot about with these, though I think actually we thought we'd use it differently than we do. This records ProRes right kind of in camera, right to the same card. You don't need to hook up an external recorder. That's great for a couple of reasons. One, you can generate proxies, which frankly the camera generates proxies better than most, like for Mac-based, for instance. That can take a really long time to make proxies on Macs, which don't have the best graphics cards. A nice Windows rig might do okay, but it's way easier to just be able to say, hey, I want a proxy like that as well. Another great example of where you might use that, we've had times where, like, for instance, a PR firm that we work with might say, hey, we would love for you guys to come and record something at our office. We want to edit something, you just have these nice cameras, come film it. Well, they're not going to know how to work with a RAW file. They just aren't. So with the RED, you can say, you know what, don't even give me the RAW file. I'm not even going to be working on this project, and they don't know how to edit RAW, so just give me a really nice looking, very nice looking ProRes file, and they can take that and drop it into whatever editor they use, whether it's a nice editor or not. Most can use ProRes, and then they can just go. And they don't need to worry about what RAW is. All they know is they got a video file, it plays like they think it should, and it works.
Yep, but I think, RAW is fantastic. I definitely come from a lot of the RAW photo world, and being able to do a lot of those things that I was able to do in video is fantastic. Little hiccups, but we'll get into that later. But Jeffrey, I know you've wanted this camera for a long time, and now you've been on a lot of shoots with it and played around with it. What's another one of a big pro for you?
So for me, another big pro is how modular it is. And I say that when I say how modular it is, like it's more modular than other cameras. Most cameras aren't modular at all. So the fact that it's even a little modular, which it's very modular, is great. So let's take, for instance, we were saying before, we shoot with GoPros, A7s, FS7s. Realistically, there's no way to modify those. There's no, like, well, for instance, our FS7s, the first thing we do, we take them out of the box, because we have two. That means, take a second one out of the box. Oh, this is great. Let's put the lens adapter on it, because we're not going to use an E-mount lens. The first thing you do is say, well, I got to put an adapter on, because I can't change the lens mount, so I have to. That's something that you just do on a RED. You just pop off a couple screws, you pop on a new mount, you might have to make a couple little adjustments. Once you're done, you've got a new lens mount. Same thing with the sensor. It's much more cost effective to send this body out to get a sensor upgrade than it would be to buy a whole new camera brain that just has that built in. Modules, for instance, right now, they have kind of like a smaller AV module and a bigger AV module. If in the future they release one that, okay, it's got true, it's got all these different ports that are ones you wanted, this is now an option. You can get this new module. You just screw it onto the back. It's not like an FS7, for instance, where the ports are built in. You better hope those do everything you need, because you really don't have an option of using anything else. You can use third-party accessories with it, of course. You run the risk of RED not necessarily liking or supporting under warranty claims some of those accessories, but it's definitely an option. Same thing with monitors. With the FS7, I know I've only got the little monitor in terms of what's built in and attached to it with like a viewfinder cable. I've only got what came from the factory. With this, I can pick to have a small monitor, a big monitor. I can have, a side plate that has different variables and things like that. It's just great. And I mean, the menu system on here is great, which I think comes to one of your next pros.
Absolutely. And I just kind of want to, but real quick before you dive into that, just kind of, I think when you see this RED here, you can really just see all those those ports and everything that you were talking about. This panel pops off, and you can throw on another accessory here. We've got this this unit here that gives us some additional outputs. But to dive into that menu you were talking about, I think one of the things that I'm probably going to show how much of a camera nerd I am here, that I love about this camera is its simple menu structure. We've used a lot of different cameras here, a lot of different menu structures, and as cameras get, more and more complex, there's more and more to do, and they obviously get placed in the menu. That's how you access things. That's how you make your changes. And as those menus get bigger and bigger and bigger, it takes more and more time to go through there.
And you hear people talk sometimes, we didn't have one of the original REDs, for example,
yes,
but
yep.
you do hear people talk sometimes that RED menu structure is very confusing, or, especially people that use some of the first generation. Well, at least from the current generation, we can speak to that pretty well.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a lot of fears, because again, that's something I heard a lot, like, it's a complex system. It's going to take you a while to get used to it. And I think within the first hour or two into it, I was like, oh, I'm obsessed with the way that this menu structure is laid out, and it's so simple. And, part of that may be with, I do think the menu system on the FS7 is there's a little too much to it. Things don't necessarily work exactly like you would expect them to. But with this Scarlet-W here, you boot it up, and, it takes a quick minute to turn on, but then you have all of your buttons right here, and you're able to move things around quickly. And, if you want to switch from 1080 to 5K, well, all you have to do is press that button. You don't have to go in and change your codec, change X, Y, and Z just to have that feature. You just hit that button that you want, and there you go. You have exactly the way the camera should work.
Yeah, for those that have never used a RED before, everything is, well, you can do everything via the touchscreen here. This is the smaller of the two touchscreens they have available, but essentially you'll get some soft controls on the screen, and obviously you have your preview image. There's also a few buttons on the side here, and these buttons can all be custom mapped to whatever you want. They could be iris up, iris down. You could make them a custom preset for a different, recording format. And then if you want, there's a couple buttons on the front here, and pretty much that's always used for record, and then you've got, a couple presets there. And then lastly, this module we referenced earlier on the side, you can take this plate off, and you can load that up with either a screen, which you basically can see all of the settings on the screen and has its own little preset buttons, or you can have a handle right on the side of the camera.
Or one of my own personal favorite features with the menu is, say you're tweaking something, you want to hop back really quick. There is a lot of subfolders like on any menu, and if it can be difficult to remember, okay, I need to go into the menu, press this, then this, then this, and that leads me to this, and then I have to switch that. Something like this, to get exactly where you were in the menu, you click the menu, and the last thing you changed is highlighted in red. Sure. So if you have to get back to something really quick, you're not wasting time thinking about it. It's just like, click this, now I know how to click this, now I know how to click this, sure. And there it is. I can see different views really quick and make a decision as fast as possible, which is just going to save a lot of time on set.
Another option that we personally haven't explored that much, but is something we've definitely thought about, very popular nowadays to throw something like this on a gimbal. It's not nearly as long as something like an FS7. It's definitely very capable, and people put them on gimbals all the time. Well, if you've ever operated a camera gimbal like a Ronin or a FreeFly system, you can't really change menus very well. I mean, you can add a little controller on the side. Some of them do that. Most of them don't even do that. Most of them, it's just pretty much you get everything set and then you go. Something we've talked about a lot is you can get, for instance, a Wi-Fi connected app that will then connect to your RED, and you could have, for instance, your camera assistant as you're walking from place to place. You, as the gimbal operator, could say, "Hey, put me into 4K slow-mo mode," and he could on his phone say, "Boom, you're there." And while the gimbal person is walking, everything just changes. That's very doable on a RED. That's a pretty easy function, and that's something that people that run gimbals all the time really want to think about, because you can't do that on something like a FS7 and A7 or a lot of cameras.
And again, it may sound silly to say, I love the menu structure of this camera, but in an 8-hour day, you might be saving yourself 15 minutes, and in 15 minutes, that that could be 10 to 15 shots that you wouldn't get otherwise, and it's just a huge time saver. And it just works the way that if you started up the system and never played with it, you would assume that it would work.
You don't know how valuable it is until you work, like, for instance, covering a live event, and you miss a shot, and you could have got that shot if I could have pressed a button to go into a preset of exactly what I want, versus I know how to get it into high frame rate mode, and I'm in standard, and I know I gotta go here, I gotta go into this menu, I gotta make 5 different adjustments. And meanwhile, you're trying to not trip over yourself as you walk from place to place, and you're missing a shot because you gotta do those steps over and over and over again. That leads me sort of into my first con. My first con would be its ability to do things like run and gun shoots. Now, this is a little bit hard for somebody like us to talk about, because frankly we have Sony's FS7 cameras in house, and those are some of the best run and gun cameras you can buy. And one of the reasons for that is because it has this outrigger handle that sits below it. On an FS7, for instance, basically it would drop down there, and then about a foot down you would have just a nice little controller that would give you a bunch of preset buttons, and you could customize. You can have a little rotary wheel, you can put your iris up and down, you can go through the entire menu system right from the remote. That's awesome, because most times in a live event you've got it down here, you've got the screen in front of you, and you really don't want to be doing this and trying to get to what you need to do. What you really want to do is you want to be able to use this hand to do it, and then watch where you're walking and also watch the screen. RED doesn't offer anything like that. It's something they should offer. If they can make an outrigger handle, but frankly set up just like an FS7's. Or even like RE's got some designs we saw at NAB a year back, does kind of the same thing. Whatever the case may be, what they really need is an outrigger handle, has a simple cable interface between the two, some preset buttons, a couple rotary wheels. An ability to go through the menus would be a plus, but not even a necessity. And that would instantly make it pretty good for run and gun.
Yeah, and I mean, RED is a definite leader in the industry, and maybe not every single person who buys a RED wants that handle, but there's definitely a big enough market to create something like that, to solve that solution. There's definitely people with RED who want that feature, and I feel like there's probably people who have maybe even shied away from it because it's like, it's not great. I have to come. There's a lot going on. There's a lot in that menu structure to play around with, and to have something, that's just remote, like you're talking about, to quickly move through would definitely be something that would get people, I feel like, more interested in the unit.
Right, and I'm sure, a lot of people's argument will be, well, these are mostly used for narrative work, but you absolutely see these at live events. Recently we were helping out at WrestleMania, and I can tell you for sure that there are broadcast cameras that are filming the live elements, and then all of their B-roll clips were almost exclusively shot on RED. And to do so, you see people with all sorts of weird handle arrangements, but none of them as nice as if there was just a nice first party from the manufacturer solution that just gave you the same kind of handle you already have on the FS7. Just use the template. I mean, the template's there. You just take that exact same design, twist it a little bit so it's the RED version, make it nice and durable. The FS7 is not that durable. It has actually held up pretty well. It doesn't feel that durable. And you just add it and just do what other manufacturers have already done. Like, you can see the steps to take to make it happen. It just hasn't happened yet.
But to tie in with that modular design, that was a big pro for you. That's something they could easily do without, messing up these cameras. But my first con, I'm going to kind of go back to my first pro, which was the ability to shoot RAW, which is, again, an awesome feature that I love. But the RAW workflow itself does have a few hiccups. And now I can't necessarily speak to what it's like editing in RAW in something like Final Cut X, because frankly I don't use it, or actually editing and not just color correcting in something like DaVinci. We use Adobe Premiere here based on what we think it's the best tool for the job, and I would definitely agree with that. But I do think there is some weird hiccups with editing RAW footage in Premiere with the system. They have their
just to set the stage a little bit. When we say the RAW workflow, all RAW workflows are a little different. We're not talking like necessarily an Adobe DNG or like a sort of generic RAW workflow. When you edit on RED, you have a specific RED code RAW format that's essentially their flavor of RAW, and you get a whole separate panel when you open up Premiere, and a lot of this feedback goes directly to that panel and how it integrates and works within the system.
Absolutely, and I think one of the things that happens with those files and with that panel is once you make a tweak to anything with it, whether it's adding a +1 to the white balance, it's going to save out a file that Premiere is going to reference. And anytime that file gets opened up, it's going to attempt to find that file and load it immediately in. Well, one of the things that we've noted, whether it's either in Adobe's program, or if we were doing something like a RED Cine-X, which is RED software to make those tweaks, is that those files don't always get picked up, unfortunately. No. And you might spend, 2-3 hours color correcting, a scene, and then you unfortunately have to spend an hour or two trying to figure out, okay, well, now I'm trying to upload these and actually get them to recognize in my editor, and I can't do it anymore.
How it's supposed to work in a perfect world is you're supposed to be able to, for instance, let's say we were shooting this video on RED. As one person is editing the clips, for instance, in Premiere, the idea is you'd be able to open up in something like RED Cine-X and look at the clips, make your adjustments, and save it out to what's called an RMD file. And that's supposed to be a reference file. It doesn't bake it in. You can still change it later. But the idea is, one person could be color grading, or you could just, as a single person, you could edit in a different piece of software. And when you come into Premiere, you just say, hey, reload from R&D, give me that reference data you made in the other program, and it's going to look exactly in Premiere like it did in RED Cine-X, which sounds very good on paper, except
doesn't always work that way, unfortunately. We've definitely had times where it's worked, and that's been great. It would be great if it worked this way 100% of the time, but right now it's probably more of like a 50-50 thing, which definitely kind of makes you question what type of workflow we should be doing depending on the shoot.
It has even some operations that are a little quirky, like RED Cine-X will have some filters. And some of those filters, it's kind of bittersweet. Some of the filters are really good.
Absolutely.
But those filters aren't in Premiere. So we have, for instance, somebody, at PEG, and he really likes, putting on one of the alchemy effects. And that's one of the ones that's just built into RED Cine-X. I like how it looks too. But then unless you export this massive file that you lose that editing capability, you're not going to get those alchemy effects because they're not in Premiere. So it's not, what it should be is this kind of one-to-one thing where everything you're seeing in RED Cine-X is the same as you see in Premiere, and every option transfers over. It just, unfortunately, doesn't always work like that.
It is very annoying that, a leader in the camera industry and the leader in, editing and Premiere, their software doesn't work as well as it probably should together.
So speaking of doesn't work, that leads us to, I believe, your next con.
Yes. Like we've said, we've had this camera for about a year. And over that year, there has been a lot of firmware updates, which on paper are fantastic. Unlike some of the other firmware updates with a lot of our cameras, like our Sony FS7 series, where we'll get the email from Sony and be like, and this is what the release is, and we're like, oh, okay, well, right now probably it's not worth the time to do the update and rock the boat, if you will. RED sends out this list, and you look at the new features with the new firmware, and you're like, oh man, how do we live? How do we live without these features? We need to install them right now.
And I think that goes to, a lot of times you hear people say if it isn't broke, don't fix it. For our FS7s, there's you know, you know what you get. It very rarely is unreliable. You know that there might be some quirks, but ultimately it works. It's never like there's this one weird issue that makes it so I can't edit. It's like usually it's like a little drawback or something, but ultimately it's workable or not something that you're like, they better release a bug fix now because this is kind of like, it's making the shoot harder than it needs to be. They should fix it.
Yeah, and to really tie in with that we install these firmware updates and we're excited to test stuff, and thankfully we definitely do test stuff before we take it on site, because there have been pretty much, I think, except for one or two, and there's been several firmware updates that RED has released where there has been some quite large hiccups that would negatively impact the shoot.
Sure.
Whether it be, little audio clips and beeps, no one wants that in their record, and there's no reason a camera like RED should have these problems. And we've sent our camera out once or twice here, and the fact that it's a continuous issue with the firmware and not the actual, it's just your camera. It's an actual firmware problem that RED is releasing to all of their cameras is a serious issue.
So yeah, and when we're talking about firmware, to be clear, we're not talking about beta firmware. We're talking about if you go to RED's website or if you're a RED owner and you download the software, this is supposed to be the stable build, but it's not always so stable. An example for what Andrew was just talking about, there's an ongoing audio issue. This camera still has it right now, where in certain circumstances, if you're, and you can definitely let this slip away from you if you're not listening for it, because frankly, you usually don't have to watch for something like this on a shoot. You'll get little audio blips in your footage. And there is ways to work around it. The easiest way, of course, is just do two system audio, which is why we typically always carry a backup recorder now anytime we go somewhere with the RED. That's fine. Well, it's not really fine, actually, to be honest. I'm saying that, but it's really not fine because we talk internally. We have GoPros, we have A7s, FS7s. Our sub $500 GoPro can record audio consistently for hours on end with no problem. This camera, which is a $20,000 plus camera, frankly, cannot do that. That's a little ridiculous when you think about it, when you don't see that from anybody else. It's not something you think about when you film on other cameras. Hey, I should make sure I really listen to make sure the audio thing doesn't happen. That's a reality with RED. It just happens. Other things on here, we have a third-party battery plate right here. That's made from Wooden Camera, generally a fairly reliable dealer of battery plates, power accessories, what have you. Firmware update comes out, it doesn't get battery percentage data. That is not unusual for things like that to happen in RED World, and people call it RED World for a reason. It really does exist, where things just work a little differently. You get firmwares that are quirky. You get firmwares that introduce an issue that then fix in the next firmware that didn't exist before that. That stuff's avoidable, and especially if you start to learn what to watch for, you can avoid it. And in RED, to RED's credit, they actually are very responsive. It's not like you're not talking to somebody in China. You're talking to somebody in the United States that is super attentive and super responsive, and they are very quick to say, send us your camera, we'll take a look. And they'll give you a nice loaner unit, they'll cover you. But it is definitely something that you should watch for. We've even had certain circumstances where we sent out our camera for an issue we were having. Turns out it was firmware related. The camera we got, which frankly wasn't even nicer, like $50,000-ish brain, came with the newest firmware, so it had the same issue.
Yeah.
That's kind of weird, because if you think about it, other people are getting that loaner camera. You got these huge professional productions of $100,000+ projects, no problem. They're getting a camera that is kind of not working right out of the factory, or at least working in such a way that you have to pay extra attention to an issue that you're not used to seeing on other units out of the box.
Yeah, and their solution when we contact them is to their go-to is always, well, first thing we do roll back on the firmware. Yeah. Which unfortunately part of RED World, something you have to do, but the definite downside is you lose the features that you wanted, and that's the reason why you upgraded the firmware. And typically, like we've kind of experienced, you kind of fall back into new issues. Sure, that one firmware issue that went away, that firmware thing is gone, but now that you went back a step, there's that old firmware issue that you had 3 months ago that you were dealing with. Yep. That's back again. And like I was saying, thankfully we test everything and we have the gear to make sure that it's never going to negatively impact the final product, what the actual client will see. but it is a pain to us when we're working on tight deadlines and we're having to do things like, okay, well, even though the sound design audio record is great and sounds good, we shouldn't have to replace audio for all that footage.
Sure.
But again, thankfully we have that gear to make a great end product.
And that kind of plays into my sort of to what we're talking to already is the reliability of it, and most of it does stem from those little quirks you see from time to time. In general, it's pretty reliable in terms of a camera in the field, and the issues that we're talking about, just to clarify, we kind of baby our cameras, I would say, compared to a lot of places.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, if you go in the like this pretty much looks like it just came off the factory,
sure.
Production line, however they build them. It pretty much looks like that. And most of our cameras do look like that. Our FS7s look pretty new right now, and we've had them for 2 years. Places that abuse them more, there are little things to watch for. For instance, there's one of the little threads in the top of the camera called a helicoil that had a little crack. Doesn't affect performance, something we'll get fixed later on. That wasn't that hard to do. That was pretty easy to do with normal force. Cables that are, the cables in general are actually pretty much fine. But what we're getting at is there are little parts of it that just cause it to be unreliable in certain circumstances if you don't know what to watch for. Once you learn that sort of world of how RED handles different sort of, software updates and the quirks come along with them, you're generally okay. But you shouldn't approach it like you approach something like, I got my new GoPro Hero 5. It's going to work. It's going to work. It has these new features. They're all going to work.
Yeah.
You really need to have the time, and not everybody does have the time to, every time they do a release, check to make sure everything is working as expected.
And, it is unfortunate that, we're comparing, some of the negatives of this don't exist in something like a GoPro, which is obviously a much more consumer, friendly unit. Definitely, a lot more affordable piece as well. But I would definitely say, looking at those two, I mean, obviously the RED is a way better unit, depending obviously what you're using it for. If you want to strap this thing on while you're surfing, I definitely wouldn't recommend it. You're going to have a whole bunch of problems. Right. But there's a lot of great features and pros with this thing. We wanted to go 2 pros and 2 cons, but if we wanted to really give a full feature video, right, we'd be talking about the pros all day.
There is 100% a reason why, if you said, hey, you're coming to us, there's no budget restrictions, no restrictions at all, just pick a camera to use. We would pick the RED all day long. It's the best camera we have in our arsenal. It, like any other camera, has little quirks. We could go down the list of GoPro quirks too. No problem at all. It's still the best camera around here, and it's still a pretty amazing piece of technology if you really look at all the advancements they've made and how they push different parts of the industry that really weren't going that way before. And it's definitely our go-to option for pretty much any shoot you can throw at it. It's just like anything else. There's all the positives, there's the negatives. In this case, there's tons of positives, a few little quirks. Since we're picking 2 and 2, it's 2.
But we know how to combat them, and hopefully in the future, RED will acknowledge them and deal with them, and we'll have workable solutions for them. But Jeffrey, if people wanted to hear about your experiences with this camera moving forward, where would you send them?
I'd probably have them just call your cell phone directly, which we're going to put probably on the bottom part of the screen right down here.
That is a possibility. Or they could just find us on Twitter, tweet at us, like us on Facebook, and comment on this video. Or head over to prittentertainmentgroup.com and probably see some blogs in the near future of new things and new experiences that we have with this camera and a lot of our other gear.
Sure, and if anybody wants, if you have a comment where you'd like to ask us a question where, hey, I'm thinking of using the RED for this type of shoot, how does it perform? Or, I want to use it in a live event scenario. People don't use them a lot in that. Have you tried doing this? We probably have. We work on a weird variety of shoots, everything from 10 cam shoots to single cam run and gun, pre-produced. It doesn't matter. We've used it in a lot of different scenarios. So if you're thinking about buying one and you're wondering, I have a question that would only really be best answered by someone that's used it for a long time, feel free to leave us a comment, and we'll try to get back to you on that. And we should be able to provide a pretty good answer. Well, there it is. The Scarlet-W, super powerful tool. We're still loving it day in and day out. From Pritt Entertainment Group, I'm Jeffrey.
I'm Andrew.
And we'll see you on the next one.